gales or severe gales in places. But it's a relatively cool day to come, despite the increase in sunshine, 10 to 14 Celsius fairly widely. And then it all goes downhill once again from the southwest. Heavy rain pushes in during the afternoon and into the evening. That wet weather could cause some issues for Kent and Sussex because of the amount of rain we've seen here recently, along with a strong wind, gales around some southern and southwestern coasts. A lively night to come. The rain pushes north. There will be some gaps in the cloud, but it's not going to be as chilly as the coming night because of the cloud and those outbreaks of rain. Now, the rain is with us first thing Thursday. It's wrapping around parts of northern England into the Midlands, parts of Wales as well. Showers elsewhere. Gradually through Thursday, the rain turns more showery, and on Friday, for most, it's sunny spells and showers, but some longer spells of rain in the north of Scotland.
Monday to Thursday nights on GB News. At 6, it's Dewbs & Co. 7 o'clock, Farage. At 8, join Mark Stein. And at 9, Dan Wootton Tonight, followed by headliners. On TV, radio and online. This is GB News.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday, and there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch. You've been cancelled. Join the Talking Pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilised conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
We are GB News.
And we'd like to say thank you
to each and every one of you
for helping our great nation
find its voice.
We're absolutely everywhere.
Across England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland.
On TV,
on radio and online.
We're proud to be
the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
On the Mark Stein Show, we cover the stories a lot of people are scared even to mention. The stuff that really matters with some of the world's biggest thinkers.
Now is his opportunity to kind of take the steering wheel of history.
Break away from the flock at 8 o'clock on GB News with the Mark Stein Show.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Dewbs & Co. Me and my panel will get stuck right into the day's events, and I can tell you, in fact, I can warn you, expect some robust debates, some strong opinions and perspectives from both sides of the fence. It's about you at home as well. I love to read out all of your comments, or at least as many as I can. So join me, Michelle Dewberry, Monday to Friday, 6 till 7 on Dewbs & Co.
Good evening, it's 6 o'clock, this is Dewbs & Co. I am, of course, not Michelle. You've got me, Emily Carver, with you until 7 p.m. Tonight, we're looking ahead to the dreaded autumn statement on Thursday. Where is the burden going to fall? I think it's going to fall on the working people of this country. Is that fair? Jeremy Hunt says every single one of us is going to be paying more tax. Is that fair? And as the proportion of millennial voters grows, are we definitely in store for a Labour government come 2024? And Rishi Sunak is in Bali, rubbing shoulders with world leaders. He's had a bust-up with Russia, but he's been accused of bottling it with Beijing. Senior Tories like Ian Duncan-Smith say Rishi Sunak needs to stay tough on China. Is he right? And they've been striking over trains, they're going to strike over hospitals, and now they're striking over biscuits. Workers walk out of Jacob's Cream Cracker Factory. Is striking now the new normal? All of that to come tonight on Dewbs & Co. But first, the latest headlines with Polly.
Emily, thank you. Good evening. The Prime Minister has told GB News dealing with illegal migration is his #1 challenge. Rishi Sunak also said his government wishes to reduce legal net migration, but refused to say by how much. The UK signed a deal worth up to £63 million with France last week in an effort to boost cross-channel cooperation. GB News has been told by the National Crime Agency that many Albanian criminals are blatantly manipulating modern slavery law by falsely claiming they've been trafficked to the UK against their will. Mr Sunak says tackling illegal migration is a priority.
government's policy and my policy is that we will want to reduce net migration over time, but I don't want to. Well, I'm not going to put an arbitrary number on it, because I want to be honest with people. And I think right now our number one challenge is getting a grip of the number of illegal migrants coming, and that's the thing I want to focus on first. I think that's what, by the way, the British public rightly want us to focus on. Our deal with the French this week is the first in a series of things that we'll need to do, but people should rest assured that this is a huge priority for me.
Well, the Shadow Chancellor Rachel Reeves said the government needs to get a grip of the system.
The overcrowding and the conditions that we've seen are just inhumane, and they must end. But we also need to be processing these cases more quickly. In terms of what's happening at the moment, only 4% of people who came to Britain last year by small boats have had their applications processed. That is not good enough. The government needs to get a grip of this system so that it is working for asylum seekers and is working for people here in Britain too.
Well, the Prime Minister has called on Russia to get out of Ukraine and end this barbaric war, blaming the conflict for worsening global economic challenges. Rishi Sunak, who's condemned the Russian president for not even attending the G20 summit in Bali, says the weaponisation of energy and food security is totally unacceptable. Addressing world leaders, including China's Xi Jinping, Mr Sunak also said the UK is ready to support Taiwan in standing up to China. He also described China as a threat to the UK's economic security.
Now, China represents a systemic challenge to our values and interests. It also represents the biggest state-based threat to our economic security. That's why it's right that we take the steps that are necessary to protect ourselves against that. Our approach is aligned with our closest allies, like America, like Canada, like Australia. I'm here at this summit talking to those leaders about our approach to China, and I'm confident that the way we are dealing with it is very much in accordance with how they are too.
Meanwhile, 85 missiles have been launched on Ukrainian cities today in what Kyiv is calling the heaviest wave of strikes since the start of the war. In a video address, Volodymyr Zelensky said the electrical grid has been disabled in many cities, and the strikes come hours after the Ukrainian president addressed world leaders at the G20 summit via video link. In a tweet, Britain's Foreign Minister James Cleverly called the latest attacks by Russia sickening and says they show Putin's weakness. Meanwhile, here, the Health Secretary says his door remains open after meeting unions representing NHS staff today. In a tweet, Steve Barclay said they discuss ways to make the NHS a better place to work and that talks will continue. Several unions are balloting their members for industrial action over pay and staff shortages. More than 4 million children are from families that receive universal credit. That's according to the latest data from the Department for Work and Pensions, which shows the number of children in households on state benefits has risen by 250,000 in the last 6 months to August. It says almost 3/4 of those families are single-parent households. And that research comes as a group of major supermarkets call on the Education Secretary to expand the free school meals scheme to all children in England whose families receive universal credit. The retailers are warning of rising food costs in the coming months and call on Westminster to do more to protect children and help struggling parents. Meanwhile, Downing Street says the death of a toddler who was exposed to mould growing in his home is unacceptable. It comes after the coroner examining the death of 2-year-old Awab Ishaq said it should be a defining moment for the housing sector. Awab, who lived in a 1-bedroom council flat in Greater Manchester, died from a respiratory condition directly related to the mould in December 2020. Rochdale Coroner's Court heard the little boy's father had complained to the local council but was told just to paint over it. Levelling Up and Housing Secretary Michael Gove says he's demanding answers.
It seems to be inconceivable that the chief executive of a housing association, earning north of £150,000, who's responsible for decent homes in Rochdale, the fact that this case was raised by Alice's father years ago, the fact that he had to get a solicitor on the case in order to try to make sure that he and his family were living in a decent home, the fact that they did nothing and hid behind procedure, I mean, honestly, it beggars belief that this guy is still in office. He's coming here in order to explain to me why it was that this tragedy was allowed to happen.
Michael Gove, you're up to date on TV, online and DAB Plus radio. You're with GB News, the People's Channel, where now Dewbs & Co is with Emily.
Thank you, Polly. Welcome back to Dewbs & Co. With me until 7 p.m, my panel. We've got David Starkey, historian and broadcaster, and the former editor of Labour List, Peter Edwards, with me till 7 o'clock. I'm terribly sorry, David, about the chair situation. You're far too prestigious and illustrious a man to have.
At least I was given arms, you know. Yes, almost an academic chair, except when it's on a stalk. But there we are. Yeah. But as we're saying, we're all in it together. These are rough times. We're suffering.
These are rough times. These are rough times. We may have to strike at GB News for a better chair for David Starkey. Anyway, I want to know your thoughts throughout the show. We're going to be talking about all sorts. We're going to be asking: are the middle classes, are the working people being clobbered too much by this government? The tax burden, it seems to be rising and rising and rising. This comes, of course, off the back of reports that we're going to be facing council tax rises. They could be going up by 5% for some people, which could be a massive hit to your pockets. Do you think that's fair? At the same time, we've got upwards of 5 million people on out-of-work benefits. Do the sums add up for you? We're also going to be looking at Rishi Sunak. He's been in Bali for the G20 summit. He's been talking about Russia, of course, but he's also been talking about China, and he seems to have dialed down his rhetoric somewhat. During the leadership campaign, I think you might remember, he was very strong on China, very strong against Chinese influence in our universities and in our economy, and of course in terms of our national security. He seems to have toned that down a little bit. Is that just the nature of being Prime Minister? You have to be a little more diplomatic, let's say. And of course, we're going to be looking at strikes, except this time strikes are happening in biscuit factories, apparently. So we want to get your views on all that. So do get in touch with me, gbviews at gbnews.uk, or on Twitter at gbnews or at Carver Emily. So we're going to be moving on straight ahead to the autumn statement. The clock is ticking down to that dreaded autumn statement, and the government isn't exactly putting our minds at ease. We've had briefing after briefing about spending cuts, tax rises, and there's another one today. As I said, it's the news that Rishi Sunak and Jeremy Hunt will allow local government to raise council tax by just shy of 5% without going to a referendum. This means an average yearly bill could top £2,000 for the first time. David, now, there's definitely a bill that has to be paid, is there not? But the question is, who should be paying? Is it fair that working people who have done the right thing, paid their dues, gone into work, done everything they can to be, you know, good citizens that the Conservative Party should be backing, and now being hit with this massive bill? Meanwhile, benefits, pensions, etc., are all due to go up with inflation.
You see, I think it's very simple. If we look at the history of tax, you know, I'm a historian. Let's try and look.
This is going to be a long,
no, it's not.
Speech.
It's going to be very short. Income tax is the standard tax introduced by Pitt the Younger at the Napoleonic Wars as a temporary measure. The first time that people on average incomes pay income tax is after 1945 and the introduction of the welfare state. If you create a universal welfare state, everybody has got to pay towards it. It's really as simple as that. If you want universal welfare, you've got universal tax. So not a long speech, a very short one, but clear and, I think, unchallengeable.
So you think income tax is the way to go?
No, I'm just saying that if you have the business of a universal welfare state, the state consumes inevitably more and more money. And more money essentially rests in average people. In other words, there is no mysterious pot of money lurking in companies. There's no mysterious pot of money lurking in these people called the wealthy. The wealthy already pay disproportionately heavy taxes. They are going to be increasingly clobbered. We've seen the 45% tax rate. The actual barrier for it, the threshold for it, is going to come down. The idea, as I said, that there's a mysterious pot of gold, so ordinary, decent working people don't have to pay for the benefits that they, their children, their parents all get is for the birds.
But Peter, does it not seem a little bit unfair that benefits, welfare payments are going to be going up in line with inflation? People's wages aren't necessarily going up with inflation. I think the average is that they're going up by 5.7%. Is it fair then that pensions and all benefits should go up with inflation, and at the same time the government is also using taxpayers' money to pay for what seems like endless cost of living payments, support packages and so on?
Well, they're far from endless, and indeed they're hardly the beginning, because
we've heard today that there may be £1,100 more of payments going to...
Well, you've got to give me more than 3 seconds before interrupting.
Sorry, please do.
So, council tax is regressive, first of all. It takes no account of the ability to pay. It's paid by nearly everyone. So although you talked about working people in your introduction, it's paid by non-working people as well, whatever their status, whether they're retired or on benefits or just very affluent. But it's a regressive tax. Secondly, you talked about the handouts from the government, but they're largely one-off. And my worry is for someone, whether they're a truck driver or work in a shop or single parent or surviving on benefits, is that they've had several years now of real terms income decreases, whether that's through earnings in a job or social security, and having a one-off sum doesn't compensate you for years of your income being eroded. Finally, I'd say, why are we in this mess? Because we had 8 weeks of chaos under Liz Truss and 10 years of poor planning.
Sorry, I'm
going
to have to interrupt you there. Come on, 44 days of Liz Truss chaos.
This is silly.
Should not be the
this
first
is silly.
This
really is silly. The actual borrowing premium, which was the effective consequence of that 44 days, has now stopped. And the idea that the gigantic deficit burden of debt that we have is the creation of 44 days and is much longer than 10 years. It goes back to Gordon Brown and 2008 and the introduction of quantitative easing. This is the fundamental thing. We heard the Prime Minister saying vigorously he wants to be honest. What do? People on the left, like Peter, blame it all on Kwasi Kwarteng. On the other hand, they've started blaming it on Russia. Russia and Kwasi Kwarteng are marginal issues. The key thing is we've incurred, largely thanks to COVID, for which, of course, the entire media, political class and administrative class, with the honourable exception of us lot on GBNews, were clamouring for yet more. We have incurred, through quantitative easing, debts on the same scale as the Second World War. Sorry, just 1 second. We really do need to understand that we're in we've had two wars. We've had the phony war, because I think it was a phony war of COVID, and the grotesquely excessive measures of furlough, loans to this, dining out. I mean, can you imagine a dining out loan on government expense? It is nobody objected.
That is hard. Looking back, it's hard to believe that happened.
The opposition clamoured for more. The media classes, apart from GB News, clamoured for more. We're reaping the reward. And then there is the real war of Russia. The trouble is, do you know what it resembles?
Go on, very quickly.
It's the 1970s. We've gone straight back to the 70s. Quantitative easing is the equivalent of the Barber boom of 1972. What's happened in Russia is the equivalent of the oil shock, the Six-Day War, and all the rest of it. And we am afraid... our menu this evening is a 1970s menu. It is inflation, it is soaring taxation, it is strikes, but we don't have a Margaret Thatcher.
Yes, but this is also the elephant in the room, is it not, Peter? It is the cost of lockdown. As David says, huge amounts of quantitative easing. We also paid people to stay at home. For you to say that it's a one-off payment, these support packages that the government has announced, is just not true. We've had cost of living payments throughout the pandemic, and it continues onwards with the new crisis of energy bills and so on, and inflation that the government and the Bank of England brought on themselves. So we are in a bit of a tricky situation. Do you think it's an inevitability now that taxes just continue to rise to pay for it all?
That's a very long question, but you've got to allow time for an answer as well.
I will.
No one has said that Kwasi Kwarteng is solely to blame for the mess we're in. And I think David calling me silly doesn't really move the discussion forward anymore. As David went on to acknowledge, the roots of this go back 10 years, and that includes the cost of COVID, and I think lockdown was the right thing to do, but poor decisions made by the coalition. So, of course, the roots of this, and I'd say ultimately, a cost of living crisis emerges because a country can't afford to look after itself, whether that's food production, energy production, investing in affordable transport, and so on. But a cost of living crisis doesn't come out of nowhere like the weather. It comes because a government has no vision of what the next 10 years holds and allows public services and public investment to erode.
But may I just also say, and this was something I mentioned in the introduction...
Sorry. Can we
come on, David,
no,
come on.
Can we just look at the endless quantities of money that have been thrown at the NHS, which then arbitrarily decides that it'll cease to be a national health service and become a national COVID service. We have the total malfunctioning of GP practices, arbitrarily deciding they can't be bothering to see patients. I mean, the issue, I agree with Peter, there has been gross maladministration, but the maladministration goes back not 10 years, not 20 years, it goes back fundamentally to the foundation of the welfare state in Britain. We have never really thought properly how to pay for it or how to manage it, and we're now reaping... So we're in a situation, and it'd be a really good thing if we could all admit this. There's nobody easy to blame, because the entire political and administrative class carries responsibility. And I'm afraid that means that we are all going to carry the burden. And there's no easy solution. There's nothing, I mean, all this nonsense about, we should be having, wonderful formulae for growth that will involve green investment. This is for the birds. It is completely
Well, of
for
course,
the birds.
one point for Liz Truss was, of course, that she did speak at least about supply-side reform, but it does seem like the institutional structures in this country, or the blob, whatever you want to call it, won't allow for such things to ever take place. Any type of radical reform seems impossible in this country. But one of the big issues that I also mentioned in my intro is the fact that we have so many people in this country who are out of work. Now, some of those people will be long-term sick and be off work for good reason, but there is a huge number of people, and it's increased massively since the pandemic, people simply not working, and they're not included in the unemployment statistics that the government bandies around.
5 million. It's 5 million
Peter,
people of
what can we
working
do?
age.
What would Labour do to get these people back? What would the Labour Party do to get these people back into work? Because it is totally unsustainable for taxpayers to be constantly funding huge numbers of people to be essentially inactive.
Well, I think you've really got to disaggregate two things, which are unemployment, people available for work who can't get work, and that's risen in recent months, and then people out of the labour market.
But it's still a very low number, those people.
Yeah, but they're two very different things. I think it's...
But sorry, answer the question.
Hang on, let Peter finish.
Focus on the question. The question is, there are 5 million odd people of working age who are not working. And that figure has risen very
sharply.
Well,
look at this. In Middlesbrough, 23%. Of working age population on out-of-work benefits. In Blackpool, that's 25%. It's not good, is it, Peter?
David's interrupting me.
Yes, I know, please do.
No, let David give the answer then, if he knows it.
David, let Peter finish his answer.
How can you increase the number of people who are available for work, regardless of whether they do get it or not? That's an incredibly tough question. I don't think any political party's got the answer. My sense is it's down to education and healthcare. They're the reasons why people are out of the workforce. And, of course, you need support for childcare, because we know we've got one of the most expensive childcare systems in the world.
But isn't there another issue, which is... We had this problem, again, historian. We had the issue of the remanagement of welfare in the 19th century. And the 19th century introduced a brutal rule. It was called less eligibility. And that said, nobody on welfare should earn more than an average wage under any circumstances. We, of course, have completely broken that. We've also, thanks to both political parties, both to Ian Duncan Smith and to Gordon Brown, we've introduced benefits, huge benefits, for people in work. Now, this again, the 19th century said, we will not do. They had what was called the Speenham land system, which involved subsidising the wages of agricultural labourers out of the poor rate. The Victorians were intelligent. They said, this will not do. It subsidises it subsidises employers to pay below living wages. We've got to address the issue of the relative benefits of working and not working. We cannot subsidise idleness. I'll quote the Bible at you.
Very quickly, we have to move on. We have to move on, David.
The Epistle to Thessalonians, he who will not work, neither shall he eat. It was also said by Lenin, and for once I agree with him.
Sounds like David's a great fan of the welfare state, Peter. But we must move on. Coming up, are we facing a millennial milestone? The next election could see millennial voters outnumber the baby boomers for the first time. What will this mean for the next election?
Every morning from 6 o'clock, we'll wake you up with GB News Breakfast with all the stories you didn't know from the night before.
So whether it's serious news, entertainment, or your own views from all over our great nation, we're here to kick off your day with a smile.
And the national media should be reflecting and reporting what's happening here.
You will notice the northwestern accents.
Whether you're with us on TV, radio, or online, every morning, it's breakfast from 6 a.m. Hope you can join us.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton Tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Hello, I'm Simon Evans. Join me on GB News for Headliners at 11 p.m, where I'll be joined by two of the country's top comedians as we take a look at tomorrow's newspapers tonight. If it's a big story, we'll be covering it, I guarantee, but we'll also have some fun along the way. That's GB News Headliners at 11 p.m. We won't put you to sleep, unlike some of the other paper review shows out there. So join us, 11 p.m, 7 nights a week.
Hello there, it's Eamon Holmes here from Breakfast on GB News. We're not just on your television and your screens, you know.
We're on DAB plus digital radio, so you can listen to your favourite shows on the move.
If you've not yet listened to GB News Radio, it's very simple. We're on your radio player and TuneIn apps, on your smart speaker, phone or tablet, or online at gbnews.uk.
Take us with you wherever you go. GB News Radio.
You never have to miss a moment of the People's Channel.
Welcome back to Dewbs & Co. with me, Emily Carver, until 7 o'clock this evening. My panel, David Starkey, historian and broadcaster, and of course Peter Edwards, former editor of Labour List. Now, you've been sending in your opinions, lots of them here. Steve just got my friendly reminder today, I think that's what they call it. One-bedroom bungalow, Band A, £1,371.21 per year, payable within 10 months. Disgusting rip-off. I mean, there is a question to ask about whether you think you're getting value for money when it comes to council tax. But then, of course, we're constantly demanding more from the state, aren't we? And with an ageing population, that is perhaps inevitable. But I do think it could be spent more efficiently. That's for sure, by our local authorities. Carol says, the working people pick up the bill every single time. The rich have more than plenty. Don't tell me if you tax the rich, they will walk. If you tax them, they may not be able to go to the Caribbean twice a year. I haven't had a holiday since 2009. I think there's some truth to that. I think sometimes it's overstated that rich people will just abandon the UK if they're taxed a bit more. But I do think it's important to get the balance right, because people are very, very mobile. And if they feel like they're not getting a good deal in this country, then they can just get up and go, or they can move their business elsewhere and pay taxes elsewhere. Anyway, we're going to be moving on to the next conversation of this evening. Are we on the brink of a millennial milestone? What does that mean? Well, figures from the Office for National Statistics suggest that millennials will form a bigger share of the voting population at the next election than their generational rivals, you could call them that, the baby boomers. It all begs the question, what do the millennials want? Peter, I'm not going to assume your age, although you did tell me in the break. You're 41 years old.
I don't mind admitting that, yeah.
I think you're just on the cusp of being a millennial. Do you think that millennial voters will start to have more of an impact now? And will that make a Labour government more possible
Well, that's a really tasty question for me because I think
Go on.
Labour always benefits from higher turnout. So if, like some countries, if we had compulsory voting, Labour would do far better. I'm not suggesting that, but the votes that traditionally, the groups that traditionally vote Labour have slightly lower turnout. That's younger people, people who are on lower pay, people who aren't white, basically. Having a greater cohort of people in the electorate who are young, essentially, that will help the Labour Party. And obviously you've got stats about demographic change, so that's just happening regardless of the fact people change their minds the older they get. But I had a quick look at House of Commons report today, and at the moment it does seem for now that pensioners continue to have a huge weight in the electorate because turnout is higher. So if you can permit me two quick stats, researchers, there's about 650 seats in Parliament, split them into the oldest 65 seats and the youngest 65 seats. So, for example, somewhere like in London will be a bit younger. There's more young people. So in the oldest seats, turnout was 61% to 78%. In the youngest 65 seats, turnout was 53 to 77%. So basically, people are more likely to stay at home in young people's areas.
So it depends on turnout, basically, is what you're saying.
So, yeah.
But I would just disagree with you on one thing, or perhaps just challenge you on one thing. You said that poorer voters are more likely to vote Labour, but we've seen quite a shift in who is voting Labour. It is a lot of graduates, younger graduates, millennial graduates, sort of office workers, progressive cultural views, that sort of person is turning towards Labour. We've also seen from lots of polling that, you know, we often talk about how people become more conservative as they grow up. People aren't now. People who are socialist when they're children, when they're teenagers, when they're young adults, are keeping those socialist values way, way, way into their 40s nowadays. So the shift in people's ideology and values is just changing rapidly, isn't it?
Well, yeah, if I may, I say something slightly different about turnout. But anyway, I think the challenge for Labour, and there is a big challenge for Labour, which is that with a very low representation in Scotland, and first past the post isn't going to help them, particularly in that regard, there's a risk that Labour, you know, as young, fairly liberal people like me turn into middle age, Labour becomes a party of cities and towns and don't get sufficient votes in you know, basically provincial Britain's much smaller towns, villages and the countryside, and to be elected as a government, both in principle, you know, one nation, and actually getting the sheer numbers of votes. You need to have representation everywhere, like Thatcher did in the 80s and like Blair did in 97.
Yeah, and the reason we're talking about this is because now the only age group in which the Conservatives have a narrow lead is the over 65s. They're finished with the rest of the electorate, it seems.
He said looking hard at a baby boomer, yes. Yeah, we make a rather interesting balance. Yes, I mean, at the moment, that is undoubtedly the case, and you can see why. I think it is an absurdity, of course, because, again, if Peter and I just stop our jousting, there's barely a sheet of paper, actually, between the policies of the three political parties, between Labour, Lib Dem and Conservative. There really isn't. The differences are utterly trivial. The levels of taxation, the general approaches to welfare have scarcely changed at all, and moreover, won't. I mean, at the moment, of course, you're in a vice. No government can do very much from this point because of simple fiscal fact. One can chatter, one can make gestures, one can offer symbolic policies. Very, very little can be done without a willingness of radical change, which has to focus on government expenditure, and the two gigantically large items are welfare and the NHS.
Well, on the welfare point...
And there's just a refusal, and nobody will think about them. So we're locked into this position.
David, would you like to could I ask David a question?
I was just going to say, no, yeah, go on, why not?
Yes.
Well, David, which benefits would you like to cut?
I think...
Triple lock?
Pardon?
Pensions triple lock?
The pension triple lock should go. It is absurd that every pensioner gets £200 or £300 a year at Christmas. I mean, it's absurd that there's universal free transport. I mean, the pensioners now include some of the richest people in the country. It is simply preposterous. It's absurd that over 75s get free television licences.
So
I'm just listing my own group where I think
bus passes in for poor pensioners.
I'm saying that they should be strictly means tested. That it seems to me to be simply Matthew Paris says exactly the same thing. If you live in London, as I do, and I use public transport quite a lot because Islington Council has made it impossible to drive in my borough, it's worth a great deal of money. It's wrong. And it is simply wrong that we throw money around this.
Let me ask the nation, David, would viewers at home of all ages, do you think that we should keep the pensions triple lock? Should pensions be going up by 10.1% while wages are only going up by about 5.7%?
It's outrageous.
Is that fair? Or do you think that, there are a lot of pensioners out there who've paid into the system all their lives and they deserve to have something to say for it at the end of their days? And also, that bus pass. My parents got their free bus pass when they turned 60. They don't need a free bus pass. It does seem a bit ludicrous that they have one now, or would that be outrageous to means test such a benefit? Peter, would Labour keep the pensions triple lock? Have they actually said what they would do?
I think Labour have done what you do in opposition, where you've opposed any risk of cut by the government. We know Richie Sunak's going to keep the trickle lock, haven't spelt it out. What I would say is actually, and I think I disagree with David on nearly everything, but there is a consensus around the triple lock, which I think is whether you call political parties scared or very respectful about pensioners, neither the Labour or Tories will cut the triple lock on pensions. And personally, I think that's quite sensible. The best way to handle the anomaly you flag of some of the costs around pension benefits tied to inflation, of course, is to get inflation down, because that helps everyone.
That's true. Inflation is the massive tax.
So we just wave a little magic wand and get inflation down.
We must move to the next topic, but I just want to read out a couple of things. Marion says David Starkey is a very clever man and is spot on about the lazy scroungers on welfare.
Well,
of those who work from home and never answer a phone, it's pathetic. Jenny says, why is the comparison always made between baby boomers and millennials? Well, that's something that Andrew also says. Andrew says, you talk about the baby boomers and millennials voting. What about Generation X? We're in between the baby boomers and millennials. Well, I'm not sure what the voting patterns are for Generation X. Anyway, coming up, is Sunak softening his stance on China? Should he be? We'll discuss.
We are GB News, and we'd like to say thank you to each and every one of you for bringing us your conversations, for helping our great nation find its voice. We are here for you on radio, television, and online, across England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland.
It's not the BBC, you actually get your facts right.
We are proud to be GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Every Friday and Sunday night from 9, it's Mark Dolan Tonight.
We're on the same page again. There's something good happening.
Let Ian finish. Don't be such a cranky.
That mini budget was the tip of the iceberg.
And on Saturday, my show just got bigger. From 8, it's Mark Dolan's Saturday Night In.
You can't govern a country if you can't speak. Stop talking.
My God, we reached the end. I've never been early in my life. Only on GB News, the People's Channel.
Monday to Thursday on GB News, it's Bev Turner Today from 10 a.m. There's never been a more interesting but also critical time in British politics, and I can't wait to bring you the biggest stories of the day with the best factual accuracy and also a few of my own opinions thrown in. We'll engage in passionate but always polite debate with your thoughts and opinions at the centre of it all. Monday to Thursday, 10 till 12 on TV, on radio and online.
Hi there, it's Stephen and Anne.
At breakfast from 6 a.m, you'll always be caught up with everything you need to know, the latest headlines, opinions and debates.
We'll bring you the good news and the bad, but most of all, we're here for you.
Remember, send in your views and let us know what you would like us to talk about.
That's because we're your news channel. And every morning at 6 a.m, it's breakfast on GB News.
Welcome back to Dewbs & Co. with me, Emily Carver. Now, we've got loads of emails coming in, particularly on that pension triple lock. Richard said, David is absolutely right about pensioners. There are some incredibly rich pensioners in this country. I have friends who are pensioners and live in the south of Spain, and they get the winter fuel payment. Yes, we didn't mention the winter fuel payment, but that's another payment that all pensioners get regardless of their income or assets. Then Nicholas says, I think they should stick to the promise to keep the triple lock, but increase the income tax rate so as to get the money back from wealthier pensions. I'm not sure how that would work. I think there is a strong case at this point in our history and our economic situation to rethink it, make it means tested. That's not to say that all pensioners are sitting there in mansions, obviously not. But there must be a case to do something about the triple lock, let's just say. And Carol disagrees. She said, we should keep the triple lock. I have paid into the system for 48 years. And that's a fair point too. I can certainly see both sides on this one. Now, we're going to be moving on to China, because Rishi Sunak has been rubbing shoulders with world leaders out in Bali this week. Among them is the Chinese President Xi Jinping. But he's being urged not to soften, Rishi Sunak's being urged not to soften Britain's stance against the communist superpower. So far, Sunak hasn't committed to designating China a threat to the UK. Now, David, Liz Truss talked a good game when it came to China. She wanted to upgrade their status, as it were, to a threat, rather than, I can't remember what the term is, a systemic competitor or something like that. So she wanted to up the ante. Sunak seems to be dialing that down. Is he right too?
I think Sunak is really, as Britain so often does in foreign relations, just following on America's coattails, even when the coat is worn by the less than distinguished President Biden. You saw Biden deliberately shaking hands with Xi, and again a dialing down of the rhetoric. I think the truth is that not much will change, because the consequence of the Ukraine war has been fundamentally a huge visible realignment in world politics. Russia and China and their hangers-on like North Korea and whatever are now manifestly and effectively united bloc. The West, that's America, the old British Empire. Europe is a rather uneven hanger-on. You know, the French have always played funny games about being a kind of pig-in-the-middle power. But there's the West. There's this now totalitarian bloc. And then, of course, there's exactly the group that they're meeting, the G20. And what's very striking is how few members of the G20, that's Indonesia, where they are, it's Brazil, it's South Africa, it's India, how very few members have wholeheartedly supported sanctions against Russia or the West. In other words, the rest of the world, you know what? They're standing watching. They're looking at China, they're looking at the West, and they're thinking, whom can we get the most from? We have this bizarre notion of a foreign policy of principle. We're fools. And we've been taken with fools, and we've been treated as fools.
Do you think that's true, Peter? Are we being taken for fools? Should we be like other third-party countries and be a little more diplomatic and not not be seen to judge other countries? Or do we need to take a strong stance when it comes to upholding liberal democratic values?
I think there's a place for values in foreign policy now more than ever. And of course, Britain has to be humble and mindful about its own shortcomings. But surely the events in Ukraine of the last 12 months show why values are more important than ever before. We're going to China. You know, Rishi Sunak's downgraded, if you like, Liz Truss's rhetoric from a pure threat to an economic rival or threat. But China is doing some very nasty things, including putting Uyghur Muslims in concentration camps, which is truly incredible in the 21st century that we're even using phrases like concentration camps. And there's worry about what China will do next. You know, here's a phrase you won't hear this week in Bali from China: we will not invade Taiwan. We know why they won't say it, because either they will do it, or they won't, but they like hanging the threat over other people.
But I guess the reality is it not, David, that we are just totally dependent on China, and therefore there's only so much we can do in terms of trying to influence the way they behave domestically and on the in terms of geopolitics?
What I'm hoping is that two things have happened. And I think they seem bad on the one hand. I think their consequences are very good. The fundamental thing is that Xi has blown the Chinese economic miracle. Xi's invocation of COVID restrictions on the one hand and the extraordinary cutback on commercial freedom in China on the other is meaning that the thing that I most feared, and I share everything that Peter was saying about the horror of China. It's simply the question of how we deal with it. My great fear was that the efficiency of China, remember, China isn't run by a collection of Oxford PPE failures. China is run by serious engineers, which is why it's done what it is. My great fear was that you were going to be able to combine originality and creativity economically and culturally with authoritarianism. If you can do that, we are lost. The formula I came up with at the beginning of the COVID crisis was get COVID, get a Chinese virus, finish with a Chinese society. And this is the terrible threat to us. The question is, how do we deal with it? I don't think posturing is the way you deal with it. We've also learned the problem of posturing with Russia. Do you remember, we thought, wasn't it going to be easy? All we need to do is stop importing oil and gas from Russia, and Russia will collapse. This huge power will crumble. And do you know what? It was like standing on one end of a rake and you were smacked by it.
Yeah, they just reorientated themselves.
And they said, where did they send them? Where did they send their gas and oil to? China and India, who bought it prodigiously. And, sorry? So we've again, this business of, yes, of course, Peter is right. Yes, the concentration camps are disgusting. Yes, the threat to Taiwan is shocking. What are we going to do about it?
But I must
what
say,
can we realistically do? The answer is nothing apart from disengagement.
Well, this is what it seems that Rishi Sunak has found out, because just looking at what has been said back in July, when, of course, he was trying out for leader of the party for the first time, when he didn't win to Liz Truss, he was talking very tough indeed. He said China is Britain's biggest long-term threat. He's right. That they represent the largest threat to Britain, accused China of stealing our technology and penetrating our university. He said they're propping up Putin's fascist invasion of Ukraine by buying his oil, attempting to bully their neighbours, including Taiwan. Now that he's Prime Minister, understanding the realpolitik, I guess, understanding the virtues or necessity of diplomacy, he's had to dial that down slightly. But do you think we need to get tougher on China, or do you think that actually there isn't a hell of a lot we can do, really? Anyway, we're going to move on. Coming up, are you a fan of the Jaffa cake? The beloved snack could be facing a shortage as workers go on strike.
Monday to Thursday nights on GB News. At 6, it's Dewbs & Co. 7 o'clock, Farage. At 8, join Mark Stein. And at 9, Dan Wootton Tonight, followed by Headliners. On TV, radio and online. This is GB News.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday. And there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch.
You've been cancelled. Join the club.
Oh, my goodness me. And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilised conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
We are GB News.
And we'd like to say thank you
To each and every one of you.
for helping our great nation
Find its voice.
We're absolutely everywhere.
across England, Scotland,
Wales and Northern Ireland.
On TV.
On radio.
And online.
We're proud to be
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
On the Mark Stein Show, we cover the stories a lot of people are scared even to mention. The stuff that really matters with some of the world's biggest thinkers.
Now is his opportunity to kind of take the steering wheel of history.
Break away from the flock at 8 o'clock on GB News with the Mark Stein Show.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewbs, and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Dewbs & Co. Me and my panel will get stuck right into the day's events, and I can tell you, in fact, I can warn you, expect some robust debates, some strong opinions and perspectives from both sides of the fence. It's about you at home as well. I love to read out all of your comments, or at least as many as I can. So join me, Michelle Dewbs, Monday to Friday, 6 till 7 on Dewbs & Co.
Welcome back to Dewbs & Co. Lots of you have been getting in touch. Andrew says, great presenter, good guests. Well, that's very nice. On China, Chris says China has been stocking up with gold for a while now, therefore we should make closer ties with them to safeguard our economy. I don't know too much about their gold. Richard said we should not be following the USA in its anti-China propaganda show. At the moment, they seem the most sensible society on the planet. China does. Well, I'm not sure, Richard, what you've been reading, but I must disagree with you on that one. Carol says, if we want to rein China in, we need to buy less from them. That's one way of looking at it. However, people would argue that free trade may liberalise the country and so on, although in the case of China, they seem to be getting more authoritarian, not less, however much they open up their economy. But yes, we're going to be moving on to biscuits. If you're stockpiling your biscuits in the run-up to Christmas, you might be in for a challenge. I'm not sure how many of you at home are actually stockpiling your biscuits, but you never know, one or two of you maybe. Hundreds of workers have walked out indefinitely from the Jacobs Cream Cracker factory in Aintree. The strike over pay could see a shortage of household favourites like the Jaffa Cake, Club Bars, Mini Cheddars and Twiglets. Peter, we've had strikes on the train, strikes now in the NHS, and now it's affecting our biscuits. Are strikes just here to stay?
Who's to say if they're here to stay? But I've been a trade unionist my whole working life. I think it's entirely reasonable that when you're offered a real terms pay cut, you consider withdrawing your labour. And I actually looked into some of the numbers earlier. Fox's Biscuits UK revenue is £450 million. The strike is over rises of 140k to just a few dozen workers on the edge of Merseyside in Aintree. As with all strikes, I think with a bit of goodwill and negotiation, you can prevent it, have a discussion, do a deal, and spare consumers any pain.
Now, this is an interesting one because, of course, it's a private company. So they're not asking for money from the taxpayer and from everyone else. Do you think this particular employer is just being a bit stingy and that actually big employers like this company need to start giving out a little more cash when it comes to salaries?
I mean, I'm definitely in favour of real living wages. As I was saying before, the idea of the state having to subsidise wages is one that I disapprove of greatly. But equally, there are brutal economic realities. What you didn't say was where Jaffa Cakes are now being made. They're being made in Portugal, because there is an international company that owns the old Jacobs Cream Crackers. So I'm afraid in Portugal, wages are lower. And this is the brutal fact of the free trade regimes that all governments, you know, the Blair government was especially keen on this, have introduced this. You're dealing with universal forms of competition. In other words, people are undercut, repeated. We've seen this with our car industry, repeatedly by lower wages elsewhere. China is now being undercut by Vietnam. But in Britain, let's face it, we are now seeing exactly, cast your mind back a little earlier in the conversation, this is the final sort of tribute act of the 1970s, competitive wage bargaining. And we saw what happened in the 70s. Of course, their behaviour is understandable. Of course it is, but we know where it goes. It finishes up in rampant inflation, which is profound. And Peter was saying he wants to root inflation out. Competitive wage claims simply sustain it and entrench it and expand it.
Now, you mentioned the living wage there, and one of the things that might be happening come Thursday's autumn statement, another budget of sorts, is that the living wage may be going up.
In favour.
Could one of the unintended consequences, Peter, of that sadly be that employers have to let people go or move jobs abroad?
I don't think so, because the Conservative government's national living wage is not statutory, and I think it's a bit of a attempt to hoodwink voters rhetorically. George Osborne introduced a national living wage, which Labour didn't vote against, but it's not an increase in the national minimum wage, so employers can pay the national living wage or choose not to pay it. And I think the nuance of that might be perhaps deliberately...
So it's more to encourage businesses and employers to take up the living wage rather than a regulation that they must follow?
Yeah, so say, for example, and I know we're short of time, but if you're a small business and you want to pay all your workers a floor of £12 an hour, you can do that anyway, regardless of what the Chancellor says. And the Chancellor just saying, we encourage you to do it and we're not offering support for it in any way economically, has no impact at all. The national living wage is it's a piece of rhetoric. The threshold legally is the national minimum wage.
Well, there you go. But David, I'm just reading here, just going back to strikes in general, the number of working days lost to strikes in the UK has risen to the highest in more than a decade, as pay growth in the public sector falls behind the private sector at the sharpest rate on record. I do wonder what the broad economic impact of all of this strike action...
I've been telling you, it simply entrenches inflation. And it's, again...
And surely our productivity is
nobody, look, everybody is behaving according to their own immediate self-interest. This is once inflation gets going, it is extraordinarily difficult to stop it without dramatic intervention or serious economic contraction. And we've just got to face this fact. There are no magic wands anybody can wave. You know, I'm old enough, I remember Barbara Castle, I remember the beer and sandwiches at number 10, I remember pleas to trade unions. None of them had made the faintest difference whatever.
And what can we do, Peter? The nurses, for example, asking for 17%, I think it's 17.6% pay rise. Everyone, I think, watching at home, and both of my panellists here, would agree that we wish nurses could be paid more. By and large, they do an absolutely fantastic job that not many of us could do. Where do you think the government should meet them? Do you agree that 17.6% is far too much at this time?
I don't think it's necessarily far too much, but I think for all public sector wage increases, sometimes there's a case for having staggered rises. For example, a nurse that attends a food bank is in far greater need of a pay rise than a consultant doctor or GP.
But then there's another issue, isn't there, which is, again, what we haven't talked about when we're talking about our gigantic problems, is the huge unfunded pension responsibilities of the public sector. The figures are gigantic. There are end-of-salary linked pensions which are totally unfunded. That's to say, they are paid out of direct taxation. With the constant increase of the public sector workforce, which we haven't talked about, it is at its highest level now that it's been for several decades.
Yeah.
This burden constantly rises. In fact, it rises almost in an extrapolated fashion if you look at how these things actually work out. We've all the time. The rhetoric of public life is this terrible word, compassion. Somebody needs something, we've somehow got to pay for it. The only hope that we have is somewhere, and I see nobody who has got the courage, the will, the intelligence to do it. You've got to have a Thatcher who will say no.
Well, there we go. David Starkey, we need a Thatcher who will say no. Now, a lot of people have been getting in touch, making jokes about biscuits. Biscuit-related strike puns. So Peter says, biscuit factory strike, crumbs. Tim says, I'm finding these biscuit strikes hard to digest. And Martin says, the world is going crackers. And David says this strike is crackers and takes the biscuits. Biscuit. I think they're quite amusing, to be fair. We have a creative audience, and we also...
They're good enough for Christmas crackers, aren't they?
There's no shortage of biscuits in the GB News office, so I'm going to be offering my wonderful panellists, Peter Edwards of Labour List, and, of course, David Starkey, broadcaster and historian extraordinaire, a biscuit as they leave the studio. Thank you very much for tuning in to Dewbs & Co. with me, Emily Carver. Now, we're going to be heading to Nigel Farage. Nigel, are you there?
Yes, I am. Good evening and thank you very much indeed. Well, one moment Rishi Sunak says China is a threat because that's what, he wants votes from Conservative members to become Prime Minister. Now it's a challenge. All the language has changed completely. We'll debate. My main debate tonight will ask, is Rishi Sunak proving already to be a weak leader? That and much more coming up in a few minutes. But first, Let's get the weather.
Hello again, it's Aidan McGivern here from the Met Office. Wet and windy in the far north, especially Shetland and Orkney during the next 24 hours. Showers elsewhere, and it will be a little colder. Particularly overnight, we'll notice that difference. Now, at the moment, an area of low pressure is close to Scotland, as well as to the northwest of the UK. They're maintaining an unsettled look, and as those low-pressure systems move into an area of high pressure over Scandinavia, the isobars tighten, and as a result, the winds have been strengthening across the Northern Isles, and we're expecting gales or severe gales here through the next few days, peaking later Wednesday. Heavy rain here as well. Otherwise, it's showers, and blustery showers at that across much of the rest of the UK, especially in the west and the south, but there will be some gaps in between the showers where we see those gaps. Well, the temperatures will dip into the low single figures across northern parts. So a colder start on Wednesday compared with recent mornings, but a bright start for many. There'll be some sunshine around first thing. Further showers in the west and the south during the morning. They tend to fade away, 1 or 2 showers elsewhere, but otherwise sunny spells for many. And temperatures will reach 10 to 14 Celsius, not far from average for the time of year. But towards the southwest, well, here we've got the next area of rain and wind moving in. Coastal gales, heavy rain pushing through southwest England into parts of Wales, the Midlands and the southeast by the evening. That rain could cause some issues for Kent and Sussex because of the wet weather we've had recently, so a rain warning in force. And the bands of rain push north, turning showery through the night. All the cloud and the gusty wind, of course, will keep temperatures from falling too low. We're looking at high single figures for most. There will be some clear spells for Northern Ireland and Western Scotland. Some sunshine here first thing once any early fog lifts. And then for the rest of the UK, it's just rain or showers for much of the morning. Generally, the breeze will continue to be strong in the far north of Scotland, as well as for eastern Scotland and northeast England. That's where the wettest weather will be. But eventually it all turns quite showery on Friday and into the start of the weekend.
I'm Mark White. As GB News Home and Security Editor, I cover those key issues that are so important to you. Our authorities, our communities doing all they can to combat violent crime. With the public services under unbearable strain, why are we still failing to control our borders? Defence, the first priority of any government, has been continually hollowed out. Can we trust our politicians to protect the armed forces? Join me, Mark White, on GB News.
We are GB News, right across the nation. You can get us on television, on radio, on digital. We're absolutely everywhere.
Amazing! You see, amazing!
You remind me of me in the European Parliament. But here's the most important bit. We are not part of the mainstream establishment. We think and speak just like you do. We are the People's Channel.
Magnificent. That's really, really thoughtful.
Come and join us on GB News, the People's News Channel.
My name is Andrew Doyle. Join me every Sunday evening at 7 p.m. for Free Speech Nation. This is a show where we address current affairs and news stories of the week with the help of 2 wonderful comedian panellists. I brought in comics because I want to give it a lighter edge, and also they work for less. See you there.